style and his way, and it's really great, folks. You're going to enjoy this stuff. This particular episode of History Twists concerns what might have happened if the first assassination attempt against South African Prime Minister Hendrick Verwoerd, which took place in 1960, had succeeded. In this first attempt, he was shot by David Pratt, a white farmer. In a second attempt, 6 years later, Verwoerd was killed by a parliamentary messenger, Demetrius Safandas, who was of mixed racial background. Now, this episode focuses on what might have happened in two different divergencies of history. The first divergence is what might have happened if Verwoerd had been assassinated in the first attempt. The second divergence is what might have happened if the second attempt had failed. So sort of a twist on a twist. It's rather interesting and complex. So listen, my recommendation to you, put this on pause for a second. Go get you a drink and a snack or whatever, because this is a roller coaster ride you don't want to miss.
Thank you, Dr. Beaver. I've had a lifelong love of South African history, and it's unfortunate that the apartheid era is the main thing people know about it. But things are not quite as absolute as one might think. I'm in no way defending this. I want to make that clear. But there are twists and turns beyond your wildest imagination here. Now, the foundation of apartheid as we know it, friends, began with the victory of the National Party in 1948. There had been segregation similar to the pattern in the United States, North and South alike, I'm sorry to say, since the unification of South Africa after the Boer War in 1910. But this was taken to its ultimate extreme. The idea of dividing up the country into separate nations, not only for people of African descent and English and Afrikaner whites, but for every conceivable ethnic and racial group, was the brainchild of Hendrick Verwoerd. He created, very similar to Native American reservations in the United States, what were known as Bantustans, from the Xhosa term Bantu, meaning people and nation. They were also known as self-governing national states and homelands. These were established by the apartheid government with the idea that the vast majority of the indigenous African Black population would be moved there to prevent them from living in the urban areas of South Africa, which were to be reserved for white people and mixed race people known as colored in their lexicon. The Bantustans were a major administrative mechanism for the removal of Blacks from the South African political system under many laws and policies created by the apartheid idea, which simply means separateness in the Afrikaans language. The idea was to separate Blacks from whites and give African people the responsibility of running their own governments, thus denying them the few rights they'd had before in mainstream South Africa and the protection of most of its laws. In other words, the Bantustans were established for the ultimate and permanent removal of most of the non-white population in what was seen as white South Africa.
You know, segregation took place throughout the history of South Africa during the apartheid era. And I understand continues to this date in one form or another. Segregation was defined as the imposed separation of groups keeping ethnic, racial, religious, or gender groups separate. The homelands started around the mid 20th century and ended in the late 20th century, say around 1994. Had Verwoerd not lived in 1960, many of the crueler aspects of this system might have been mitigated, if not ended.
Conversely, many of the leaders of today's integrated multiracial government have personal connections to the old system. The best example is Nelson Mandela's cousin, who took charge of the so-called Transkei homeland that we'll get to later. But in the first scenario, Verwoerd's death plunges the National Party into disarray. His death is a moment of uncertainty and chaos for the government. He was not just a prime minister. He was the ideological powerhouse behind the apartheid system of racial separation. Without his iron will and single-minded vision, the National Party faces a power struggle with many factions vying for control. The leadership vacuum in this earlier period is filled by a more cautious figure, Eban Danjez, the Minister of Finance. He was an international banker and quite brave. He was next in line. Unlike Verwoerd, Danjez lacks the charisma and fervor needed to unify the party around apartheid's most extreme policies. This opens the door for moderate voices within the National Party who argue that apartheid in its most aggressive form is unsustainable both domestically and internationally. The United Nations, already critical of South African racial policies, intensifies its scrutiny. Without Verwoerd's unyielding stance, Danjez finds himself increasingly pressured by the international community in the way leaders were in the 80s and 90s in our time. Economic sanctions and the fear of diplomatic isolation loom large.
Unlike Verwoerd, Danjez is pragmatic. He recognizes that maintaining strict apartheid could lead to economic ruin. To placate both international critics and a growing internal opposition, Danjez begins to introduce cautious reforms. These changes are far from the end of apartheid, but they represent a significant departure from the hardline policies Verwoerd would have continued to enforce. Meanwhile, within South Africa, Verwoerd's death emboldens the anti-apartheid movement. Figures like Nelson Mandela and Robert Sobukwe, inspired by the government's weakening resolve, began to push even harder for change. The African National Congress, or ANC, and Pan-Africanist Congress, the PAC, intensify their campaigns, hoping the regime is not as indestructible as it once seemed. Liberal members of the opposition Progressive and United Party apply political pressure for economic and political reforms. The government's response is still brutal, but without Verwoerd's zeal, there is less of the cold, calculated cruelty that marked the apartheid years under his rule. Instead, the government's repression is erratic, often heavy-handed, but lacking a cohesive strategy. This inconsistency only fuels the resistance further. In this alternative reality, by the mid-1960s, the political landscape has shifted. The National Party, divided and struggling, begins to see the writing on the wall. A new generation of leaders, seeing the futility of maintaining apartheid in its original form, starts to push for a different approach. Incremental changes are introduced, petty apartheid laws are relaxed, And the homelands policy, while still enacted, is not pursued with the same vigor.
Let me just explain very briefly. Petty apartheid, the term was used for social segregation, separate schools and bathrooms, as opposed to grand apartheid, which is the idea of a separate political identity. These changes do slightly reduce the pressure, but they're insufficient to satisfy the correct and growing demand for equality. But they do create a crack in the once impenetrable wall of apartheid, a crack that the liberation movements exploit with increasing effectiveness. In our alternate timeline, after successfully suppressing its internal opposition, South Africa experienced significant economic growth, providing the National Party an opportunity to strengthen its grip on the state. In this timeline, during an era of grand apartheid, the government undertook extensive social engineering projects. From the 1960s onward, millions of people of all backgrounds were forcibly relocated, primarily to the homelands, as part of an effort to consolidate the country's ethnic divisions. This process involved the structural violence inherent in the migrant labor system, as well as some degree of physical coercion, leading to severe human rights violations that are difficult to quantify.
I'm wondering if our listeners are going to get a real good handle on when you use the term homelands. Could you maybe say a little bit about that, what they were?
Homelands were, that's why I used the example of Native American reservations before. They were the traditional living areas of African tribes. This is one main difference. In our country, Native Americans were relocated from their traditional territories over and over again throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. The South African idea was that these areas had been the primary living locations of the African people prior to vast industrialization in the 1920s and 30s. So it was a foolish but somewhat organized idea that every African group would have its own territory with its own courts, passports, money, basically would carve the country up into 10 African nation states. They ultimately only had 4 that were given unrecognized by the rest of the world independence, but 10 African nation states, an Indian territory in the north, and the vast majority of the urban areas reserved for white and mixed race colored people. So it was the ultimate expression of everyone being all free to live in their own separate sections.
One of the things that you have said to me many different times is that in doing this separation into homelands, oftentimes people who have had traditional grudges against each other, didn't like each other, were stuck in the same homeland.
That happens throughout the African continent during the colonization period in the late 19th century and so on. Borders are created for the benefit of British, French, and Dutch colonialists, and there are people who genuinely did not like each other that find themselves in the same location. And then when colonization ends for most of the world in the mid-1960s, you have internecine quarrels because people who do not like each other have been forced or incentivized to live side by side. And without some sort of forcible power keeping them from fighting with each other, you do get a lot of conflicts.
Yeah, okay. So in the 1960s and 1970s, elaborate and often absurd measures were taken to establish African-led administrations within the homelands. with the Transkei serving as a prototype for other regions. In 1963, the South African Parliament passed the Transkei Constitution Act, which replaced territorial authority with a self-governing legislative assembly with limited lawmaking powers. This assembly consisted of 45 elected members and 64 ex officio chiefs who were government employees under the 1951 Bantu Authorities Act. A chief minister was elected from this group, who then appointed a homeland cabinet. Following the first general election later that year, Chief Kaiser Mantazima was elected chief minister, largely due to the support of the non-elected chiefs. Nearly a decade passed before another homeland followed Transkei's example. To expedite the process, the South African government enacted two pieces of legislation in 1970-71 aimed at facilitating the political development of the remaining homelands. The Bantu Homelands Citizenship Act designated all African South Africans as citizens of a homeland, even if they lived in the White Republic. At the same time, the Bantu Homelands Constitution Act allowed the Prime Minister to grant self-government to the homelands by decree, bypassing the lengthy legislative process used for the Transkei.
This alternate timeline, the alternate timeline that I create here, many changes would have been made. Reforms would have been made to the so-called past laws, which existed from the 1940s to 1986. Now, the past laws were documents limiting African people's movement. They had, unless they'd been born in a white city, they had to carry a pass in order to live there or travel to there. The Opposition United Party had fought against the expansion of past laws to women and against imprisonment for so-called past offenses. Now, the United Party is an English-speaking and Afrikaans-speaking alliance, which was very much against apartheid, but was not in favor of immediate integration like the Progressive Party was. They desired what they called a race federation. There was to be no economic discrimination, equal pay for equal work, and so on. Some degree of social separation. The Bantu peoples, the indigenous Africans, were to be represented in the parliament by either white or mixed race people, as I said, known as colored, while representing themselves on the provincial level. Universities were to be fully integrated, and high schools were to be segregated, but actually equal. As I said, Africans who had not been born in the cities outside of the homelands had to get specific permission to reside there under the national government, and the United Party and the Progressive Party were very much against that.
The United Party advocated complete freedom of movement. During this period, African leaders in the dominant political movement, the African National Congress, were led by Albert Luthuli, a future Nobel Prize winner. He sought greater participation in government, not full control. Nelson Mandela was a well-thought-of local leader and not the icon he would become. If Verwoerd died, Mandela would have possibly found a partnership with his uncle, Kaiser Mantazima, who in our timeline took charge of the first Zoasic homeland. The name of the Republic of Transkei comes from two words, trans, which means across, and then the reference to the Kai River.
That is a very beautiful site. I've seen that in my travels. In this alternate timeline, there would be greater African unity because there would be no split between the multiracial African National Congress and the African-only anti-communist Pan-African Congress, led by Robert Sobukwe. Sobukwe and these lesser-known leaders would play a larger role. I think a more moderate viewpoint on all sides would have led to a coalition government similar to what we got in the 1990s in our world 30 odd years earlier. I don't know whether it would have been absolute majority rule government, but in my way of thinking, there would have been greater opportunity for all. The idea of a national convention for a new constitution was supported by the Liberal Party, which is the strongest white opposition to apartheid, which was moving in an integrated direction. Elder statesmen like Albert Luthui, as I said, would be a Nobel Prize winner, supported compromise. Speeches and resolutions condemned the new white-only constitution of the minority regime. The ANC demanded a newly representative non-racial national convention. Dr. Sobukwe was afraid that if the government refused, there would be violence, or his movement would be seen as a communist front, as the Soviets, for their own reasons, wanted a foothold in Africa. The collapse of the British, French, and Belgian empires led to a powerful vacuum in these newly developed areas the communist nations sought to fill. Eric Lau's book, Decolonization in White Africans, related to some of the changes, the removal of white settlers, more conservative Africans, and intermediaries like the Indians and Chinese from newly independent other African societies.
So there was a division within the mixed race community. Solomon Dali, the provincial councillor for Cape Town, would be appointed president of the House of Assembly. He would lead the faction that sought assimilation. Thomas Schwartz would be appointed Minister of Home Affairs, the African counterpart to the Secretary of State. Similar to the Swiss government, there would be multiple presidents representing whites, coloreds, and 8 different African groups. A permanent coalition would promote compromise and diffuse tensions. Dr. Deneen, in this alternate timeline, what would have happened if the 1966 attempt had not succeeded?
Well, what we've been looking at up to now is a time frame in which apartheid is greatly modified, if not entirely ended, because it doesn't have the time to take root. But by 1966, attitudes had hardened. Now, I need to set the stage to deal with this alternate history timeline. In our actual timeline, Dimitros Safendas, Woodward's assassin, was judged insane and locked away under terribly abusive conditions for the next 40 years. He claimed to have been instructed by a tapeworm in his stomach, although some historians believe this may have been an act to avoid an almost certain execution. He stabbed the prime minister in our timeline in Parliament in front of the entire government during the State of the Union. He's been thought to be an agent of everyone from the CIA to the Communist Party to diamond magnates who didn't like the effect the Homeland Policy would have on their profits. But of all the Afrikaner leaders, Hendrick Verwoerd was the most committed to a true partition of the country, which almost everyone, from national anti-apartheid leaders like Helen Suzman, the leader of the Progressive Party, the business tycoons who were terrified of losing what they saw as chief African labor, everyone opposed this idea for different reasons. Before I go on, I must make it very clear, I'm not in any way advocating racial segregation or a hierarchy. The ultimate story of the Homeland Program is detailed in Ivor Wilkins' book, The Super Afrikaners. This details the plans that probably would have gone into place had Verwoerd lived for expanding the homelands. These plans were the brainchild of a secret group. The Afrikaner Broederbond means brotherhood, sort of a cross between the Trilateral Commission in our time and the Freemasons. It's a secret society to which the elite of the Africana community in Protestant religious life, business, and politics belonged. Their leaders, known as apostles, thought they needed more land because under the homeland system, the African people were restricted to 15% of the land. So they wanted to bring so-called imperial protectorates, former British colonies in Southern Africa that were right near South Africa, into their society and then assign that territory to bigger and more productive homelands.
The High Commissioner was responsible for governing the following territories, in each case represented by a residential commissioner. Basutoland gained independence as Lesotho on October the 4th, 1966. Bechuanaland Protectorate gained independence as Botswana on September 30th, 1966. Swaziland gained independence on September 6, 1968. It's now Eswatini. Lucas Mangope, head of the Tswana homeland, the Republic of Botswana, felt that the borders between Botswana and his homeland were arbitrary. He sought an alliance with the Venda peoples and the Bastars, originally called bastards, who were the product of illegal relationships between German settlers and the Khoikhoi people, formerly known as Hottentots. Dr. Verwoerd survived because Cervantes is granted his racial classification order. Cervantes had fallen in love with the deaconess of a Zionist apostolic church known as the 2x2s Fellowship. The young woman, Ms. Helen Daniels, was a level 2 Cape Colored, one of the classifications they used. But because of his childhood in Portuguese Mozambique, Sanferas was classified as white. We're in this new timeline. Progressive Party chairwoman Helen Suzman, a noted anti-apartheid stalwart, takes up Sanferas and his quixotic cause to be reclassified as colored. From 1951 to 1988, boards of racial identity were empowered to reclassify men and women as white, Indian, Bantu, or colored. There were 10 Bantu and 7 colored subclassifications, which determined who could marry whom. In this new timeline, as an act of pity, the Board of Racial Classification allowed him to marry the love of his life, and she performs a role similar to Empress Theodora of the Byzantine Empire in calming Justinian. Check out our podcast at Things You Don't Know, 4275, about Justinian and Theodora. Therefore, on September the 6th, 1966, only fellow politicians and no murderer awaited Verwoerd as he walked to the parliamentary dais to report on his meeting with Lesotho Prime Minister Joseph Jonathan. In this timeline, Verwoerd serves as Prime Minister for another 5 years.
As a result of his meetings with American political writer Alan Drury, who referred to Verwoerd in his book on his African travels, called A Very Strange Society. Check that out, friends, if you can. As a great man in his own strange context, Verwoerd saw that changes needed to be made in order to ensure white survival in a rapidly decolonizing continent. Rather than trying to dominate the white-ruled nations of South Africa and Zimbabwe, then known as Rhodesia, would assist and ally themselves with newly liberated African nations whom they could, quote, guide. In exchange for generous financial aid, we would believe that several land transfers would be undertaken to expand homelands. In this timeline, an agreement has been reached to transfer the former Lesotho capital of Maseru to the just one homeland. In 1967, the Soho peoples make a similar arrangement in exchange for a 5-year tax exemption for their 180,000 workers in the South African diamond and gold mines. The Lesotho government reconstitutes itself in a new city called Butha-Buthe in the south. As an incentive to calm the political waters, all restrictions on non-white soldiers serving in the South African Defense Force are removed over the next 2 years. The restrictions on employment, movement, and education for the Africans would be altered either with the exception of homeland citizenship or migration to Natal province, which would be a jointly administered community between the Zulus and the largely Indian population that ran most of the mining and business operations, whites being financially incentivized to return to the Cape Province or the largely agricultural Orange Free State.
Wow, sounds very confusing. I'm sure there would remain some opposition. How, in this alternate timeline, does the government deal with that?
Well, I think it would use a combination of carrot and stick methods. Large financial rewards for those building schools and businesses within homeland areas, exile rather than the harsh imprisonment of reality for those who didn't want to do that. So in this mindset, by 1970, the Cape Province was a homeland for white and mixed-race colored people. 10 Bantustan homelands had been established. Natal was bifurcated between the Indians and Zulus. I really believe most people in that society, and I certainly would have, preferred an integrated, multiracial democratic system, but if one has to separate, it cannot be done with all take and no give. My way seems the only sane way to do so.
I'm sure that that you could go on for a long time, and there are obviously many more questions that could be asked, and probably that you could answer, but that might take another hour.
It easily would.
So we'll probably need to kind of curtail this. Hopefully, it has stimulated some interest, and we can encourage you to do that and find out more on your own. There are very good resources that are available to give you an idea. So this is by no means a utopia, this proposed alternate history, but seems to run more smoothly than other attempts at partition. One cannot have a segregated society and access to Black labor at the same time. It does seem very strange to me that all of this would happen in a continent that was predominantly Black. And I mean, it's really a sad comment in many ways on humanity that we would have this kind of view, this white minority ruling everything and whatnot. And unfortunately, I also see that happening in present day United States in some ways, and that is very disturbing to me. But whatever, there's so much more that can be said. Gosh. Anyhow, look, I hope you've enjoyed this, and that you will join us for some other things. We have some goodies coming up. And don't forget our podcast at Things You Don't Know, 4275. And that's YouTube at Things You Don't Know, 4275. And you can see a lot of things that are factual. Those are factual podcasts. History Twist is, of course, speculative. And we hope to have you back. We have some good things coming up here too. But for
There are many things coming up, friends. As I said, I've been to this beautiful South African country twice. In a way, I'm very happy that neither one of these scenarios happened, because the nation went through a crucible together, and people that I've met of all backgrounds seem to realize they need each other. And it's certainly not a utopia, and there are still problems. But I was in all the places I've been all over the world, I've never been more welcomed. And it's one of the ironies of history that at the very time Verwoerd and his cohorts are planning all of these bizarre things, they're also pushing inclusion for people with exceptionalities 30 to 40 years before the rest of the world was thinking about that. It's one of the things that makes history so fascinating. Nothing is absolutely one way or the other. So, as Dr. Weaver said, there's a lot coming up in both on this site and on Things You Don't Know. Please give us a like, join us, leave comments. I mean, as I said, and he said, there were many wonderful books and films about these stories. I only want to start a discussion, but I believe that that is what a good historian does: plant seeds, put out ideas, and get people to start talking and thinking about them. Okay, friends, hope to see you again soon.
bye for now.